The ring was plain gold, worn thin on one side from 11 years of wear. Clara Holt had not looked at it in 3 days, not since she understood what she was going to have to do. It was the morning of June 4th, 1852, and the wagon train had been stopped at Fort Laramie for 2 days. They would leave again at first light on the 6th, with or without her. The wagon master, a thick-shouldered man named Harold Pratt, had made that clear 3 times already. He had a schedule to keep. He had a mountain pass to cross before October. He did not have time for a widow who had run through her provisions early. Clara had 3 children. Emmett was 10 and old enough to understand when she told him not to ask about supper. Mary was 7 and not old enough, and kept asking anyway. And little George, she still called him Little George though he would be 5 in September, had been running a fever since the Platte River crossing. A low and persistent heat that scared her more than anything else on this trail had managed to. She had been rationing for 6 weeks. She had given the children her share more times than she could count, and told herself she wasn't hungry, and gone to sleep with her stomach folded in on itself like a letter with no address. She had traded her second dress at a crossing 2 weeks back for a sack of dried beans. She had been too proud to ask for help, and now the beans were nearly gone and the pride felt like a luxury she could not afford. The ring had been Robert's mother's ring, and Robert had slipped it onto Clara's finger in the parlor of his father's house in Springfield, Missouri, on the 19th of March, 1841. She had been 21 years old. She had loved him without complication for 11 years, and then cholera had taken him in 4 days outside of Independence, before they had even reached the Missouri River crossing, before this journey had properly begun. She had buried him in Kansas soil with a wooden marker that would not last a winter, and she had made a decision standing at that grave that she would not let his death make the journey meaningless. He had wanted Oregon. He had talked about it for 2 years. The land, the rain, the valley where a man could start again. She would take his children there. She would finish what he started. That had been the plan. That had been the plan for 6 weeks and 640 miles, and now she was standing in the dusty yard of Fort Laramie, Wyoming territory, looking at the plain gold ring on her left hand, and understanding that some plans require things of you that you never agreed to when you made them. She went into the trading post at 7:30 in the morning, when the light was still low and most of the wagon camp was not yet moving. She did not want witnesses. She set the ring on the counter and told the man behind it what she needed: flour, salt pork, coffee if he could manage it, enough to get 3 children to Oregon. The man behind the counter was named Anders, a Swede with yellowed fingernails and a proprietary manner, and he looked at the ring the way men look at things they are about to offer less for than they are worth. He named a price. It was not enough. Clara stood very still and said so, and named a different price, and Anders shook his head, and they went back and forth twice more before a man near the door spoke up. She had not noticed him when she came in. He was sitting on a barrel near the window, a tin cup of something in his hands, watching the yard outside with the particular patience of a man who has learned how to wait. He was maybe 35, dark-haired, with dust worked so deeply into his clothing that it seemed almost part of the fabric. He was not a trapper, she could tell by his hands, which were calloused but not scarred, and not a settler, because he was traveling alone. She did not know what he was. He said, without turning around, "She's asking a fair price, Anders." Anders looked at the man. Something passed between them that Clara could not read, some history or understanding she was not part of. And then Anders named a third number, which was closer to what she'd asked, and Clara said yes before she could think about it any further. She did not look at her hand as she walked out of the trading post. She looked straight ahead, at the gate of the fort and the pale blue sky beyond it, and she told herself she would think about it later. Later, when the children had eaten. Later, when George's fever had broken. Later was a place she had learned to put things on this trail. She was almost at the gate when she heard boots on the hard-packed dirt behind her. "Ma'am?" She stopped. She turned. The man from the trading post was standing a few yards back, holding something in his closed fist. He did not look at her the way men sometimes looked at a widow on the trail, with that measuring, assessing quality she had come to recognize and hated. He looked at her like someone who had just witnessed something and was not sure yet what he owed her for it. He held out his hand and opened it. The ring sat in his palm. "I bought it from Anders before you'd gotten your flour weighed out," he said. "I'd like to give it back." Clara looked at the ring. She looked at him. She said, with more steadiness than she felt, "I don't accept charity." "It's not charity," he said. "It's a loan. You can pay me back in Oregon." She studied him for a long moment. She was not a woman who trusted easily. The trail had not made her more trusting, and neither had life before the trail. But there was something in his face that was not performance. He was not trying to be a hero. He looked, if anything, slightly uncomfortable, like a man who had done something impulsive and was now committed to seeing it through. "I don't know that I'll ever be able to pay it back," she said. "I have 3 children and a wagon and no husband and 1,000 miles left to walk." "I know," he said. "I still want you to have it." His name was Caleb Marsh. He told her that much before he walked away. He did not offer anything else, and she did not ask. She slid the ring back onto her finger standing in the yard of Fort Laramie, with the morning sun starting its climb and the wagon camp beginning to stir, and she stood there for a moment with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling the cool weight of it against her chest. She did not see Caleb Marsh again that day, or the next. By the time the wagon train pulled out on the morning of June 6th, she had begun to think that perhaps he had gone a different direction, or ridden ahead, or simply been a strange and inexplicable kindness that the trail had offered and then withdrawn, the way the trail sometimes gave you a perfect morning right before it took something from you. She thought about him more than she thought she should, and then told herself to stop, and then thought about him anyway. The trail west of Fort Laramie was harder than anything that had come before. She had heard this from other women, from the diaries that passed hand to hand in the wagon camps, from the older emigrant women who had been west once already and come back east to guide family out. But hearing about it and walking it were 2 separate countries. The land rose as they moved toward South Pass, the air thinning almost imperceptibly, the grass going shorter and more stubborn, the sage growing in wide silver-green colonies that smelled, when the wind came through, like something ancient and dry and indifferent to human ambition. Emmett walked beside the wagon most days now, to spare the oxen. He was 10 years old, and he did not complain, and watching him Clara felt something that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between them. He looked like Robert around the eyes. He had Robert's habit of going quiet when things were hard rather than loud, the way some men do, as if silence is a form of load-bearing. Mary walked sometimes and rode sometimes, and asked a great deal of questions about Oregon, most of which Clara answered as specifically as she could. Yes, it was green. Yes, it rained often. Yes, there would be a proper house eventually, because she had noticed that what Mary needed was not comfort exactly, but information. Facts were Mary's version of a hand to hold. Little George's fever broke on the 3rd day west of Fort Laramie, sudden as a door opening, and Clara cried in the dark of the wagon that night where none of the children could hear her, not from sorrow, but from the specific exhaustion of fear that has been held in the body too long and has finally been released. South Pass came on July 2nd, a Wednesday. She wrote the date in the small journal she kept because it was the highest point of the journey, 7,412 feet above sea level, the guidebooks said, and she felt that a place that high deserved to be recorded. The pass itself was nothing like what she had imagined. She had expected drama, a cliff face, some sense of having crossed something enormous and visible. Instead it was wide and almost gentle, a long meadow between 2 ridges, the wind cold even in July, the sky a particular shade of blue she had never seen in Missouri. Vast, that was the only word for it, a blue so deep it made the chest ache to look at. She wrote in her journal that evening, "Crossed the divide today, felt nothing heroic, felt only glad to still be moving." Fort Bridger came and went. Soda Springs came and went. The Snake River plain opened up before them like a flat iron laid across the earth, treeless and pale and shimmering in the August heat, and the alkaline dust worked its way into everything. The food, the water barrel lids, the creases of her hands, the corners of the children's eyes. Little George's cough returned, different now, drier. She watched him with the constant peripheral attention of a woman who has learned that on this trail the body gives warnings before it gives catastrophes, and you miss the warnings at great cost. It was somewhere in the Snake River Plain, near the crossing at Glenn's Ferry. The river wide and pale green, the current deceptive beneath its calm surface, that she saw Caleb Marsh again. He was on the opposite bank when she first spotted him, helping guide a rope line across the water for a wagon that had gotten into trouble in the current. She recognized his posture before she recognized his face, that particular quality of stillness even in the middle of movement that she had noticed in the trading post at Fort Laramie. He did not see her. She told herself she was not disappointed when he did not look up. Their crossing was managed well enough. The wagon master had hired a local man to assist, and they moved the wagons across one by one through the long afternoon, the oxen wide-eyed and straining, the water cold enough to make her gasp when it reached her knees. She held George in her arms for the crossing, his face pressed against her neck, his small hands gripping her collar with a confidence she was not sure she had earned but was grateful for all the same. That evening, camped on the western bank, she heard Emmett's voice outside the wagon talking to someone she didn't recognize, and she climbed down to find her son deep in conversation with Caleb Marsh. They were talking about oxen. Caleb was crouched on his heels in the way of men who are comfortable outside, and Emmett was standing with his arms crossed in that manner he had adopted recently, half boy, half something else, and they were discussing the particular stubbornness of her lead ox, who had been favoring his left foreleg since morning. Caleb looked up when she approached. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Your boy tells me you've got an ox going lame," he said. "I've been watching him," she said. "I'd like to have a look if that's all right." She said it was. She stood back and watched him examine the animal in the fading light, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, and she thought, "He has done this before. He knew the land and he knew animals and he moved through the world with a competence that was neither boastful nor apologetic. It simply was." He found a stone worked deep into the hoof, embedded since at least morning, removed it with a small knife he carried, and packed the hoof with a poultice from his saddlebag. He told her the ox would be sore for 2 or 3 days but should be sound after that. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He was replacing things in his saddlebag. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "why are you traveling alone?" He was quiet for a moment. "Same reason most people come out here," he said finally. "Starting over." She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. "I don't know anything about you," she said. "You gave me back my ring at Fort Laramie, and I've thought about that more than I'd like to admit, and I don't even know what you do or where you're going." He looked at her then, a full, level look that did not avoid anything. "Oregon," he said. "I've got a land claim near the Willamette Valley, 160 acres. House is built, there's no one in it." She did not know what to say to that. "I'm not telling you that for any reason," he said quickly. "I don't want you to think I'm—" He stopped. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had said something he hadn't planned to and wasn't entirely sure how to contain it. "I just meant that I'm going the same direction. In case the ox gives you trouble again." She told him good night. She climbed back into the wagon and lay down beside George, who had already fallen asleep, and she stared at the canvas above her and listened to the particular quiet of the Snake River Plain at night. Not peaceful, not silent, but vast, the wind moving in long sweeps across nothing. The distance between one thing and another almost impossible to measure. She was 32 years old. She had buried her husband in Kansas. She had sold her wedding ring and then had it given back to her by a stranger, and she had not found a good place to put any of that yet. She had 160 empty acres waiting at the end of another person's loneliness, and she was not in a position to want anything from them. She was almost certain she wanted something from them anyway. The Blue Mountains came in September, and they were brutal in the way the trail reserves for the very end, as if it wants to make sure you have truly earned what you are arriving to. She had been warned. Everyone had been warned. But the Blue Mountains of northeastern Oregon have a particular quality of difficulty that resists description. They are not the highest peaks on the journey, not the longest stretch, but they combine steep grade and rocky terrain and the first real cold of approaching autumn in a way that breaks equipment and animals and sometimes people. 3 wagons in the train had to be abandoned before they'd cleared the first ridge. She heard those families making their decisions in the morning, the quiet, terrible accounting of what to take and what to leave, and she felt the sound of it settle in her chest like something permanent. Her wagon held. Caleb appeared at the worst of the grades without being asked, setting his shoulder against the back of the wagon to push, and Emmett pushing alongside him, and the oxen heaving forward, and the whole assemblage groaning up the slope inch by inch in the cold morning air. Nobody spoke. There was no breath to spare for words. There was only the hill and the weight and the next step and the one after that. On the far side of the worst of it, in a thin meadow where the train stopped to rest the animals, Caleb sat down on a rock beside her without ceremony. They were both breathing hard. George was asleep in the wagon. Mary had walked ahead with another girl her age, something she had begun doing in the last few weeks, and it made Clara feel something she couldn't name, relief and something adjacent to loss, the two of them arriving together the way they often did now. "My wife died 2 years ago," Caleb said. "Fever. We'd already built the house." Clara looked at the mountains still ahead of them. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't say it for sympathy," he said. "I said it because I thought you should know." He paused. "I've been thinking about how to have this conversation since Glenn's Ferry, and I don't seem to be getting better at it." She almost smiled. "What conversation?" "The one where I tell you that I bought your ring because I couldn't watch you walk out of that trading post without anything that was still yours, and then I gave it back because it didn't belong to me. And I've been keeping pace with this wagon train for 6 weeks because—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I'm not built for speeches." "I know," she said. "I'd like to see you settled," he said. "You and the children. I'd like to know you're all right. And after that," he shook his head slowly, "after that is up to you, all of it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the thin meadow. Somewhere far below them, the Snake River was still running, too far away to hear. "I haven't thought about after," she said. "I've only thought about the next day, the next crossing, the next meal." She looked down at her left hand. "I don't know yet who I am on the other side of this trail." "No," he said, "I suppose not." And then, quietly, "Neither do I." They came down out of the Blue Mountains on September 19th, a Monday, and the Willamette Valley opened up before the wagon train in the pale autumn light, and half the women in the camp began crying, which Clara had been told would happen, and still was not prepared for. The grass here was different, green in a way the prairie grass never was, deep and particular, the rain green of a land that does not have to beg for water. There were trees with leaves that moved in the wind like they were glad to be alive. The air smelled of damp earth and cedar and something she could not name, something that had no equivalent in Missouri. Mary pulled on Clara's sleeve and said, "Is this it?" "Almost," Clara said. "Oregon City first, then we'll see." Oregon City was another week's journey, and they made it without incident, which felt almost suspicious after everything that had come before, as if the trail were playing one final trick, letting her arrive without drama, without last-minute catastrophe. Just road, and then town, and then the end of the road. She had planned to feel something enormous when she arrived, something proportionate to 2,170 miles. What she felt instead was very tired, and very quiet, and underneath both of those, like a fire built low enough to last the night, something that might have been, given enough time and rest and dry stockings, something like peace. She filed her land claim. She had carried the paperwork all the way from Missouri, Robert's documents and her own, the pages he had spent 3 months assembling before he died. The man at the claims office looked at her and at the papers and at the 3 children arranged behind her like a small and serious delegation, and he said nothing except "sign here," and that was exactly right. She had 160 acres. She had no house on them yet, and no help, and winter coming on fast. She found Caleb that evening in the yard of the inn where the wagon train was spending its last night together. He was sitting on the porch steps, his hat in his hands, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps. She sat down beside him on the step. Their shoulders were almost touching. The night air smelled of rain that hadn't arrived yet. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I'm going to need help," she said. "Building. Getting through winter. Getting the land into shape for planting in spring." She looked down at the ring. "I can't pay you money. I don't have any. But I'll cook, and I'm a good cook, and I'll be fair about the work." Caleb looked at the ring too. "Clara," he said. He had begun using her given name somewhere in the Blue Mountains, and she had let him. "I'm not looking to be paid." "I know," she said. "I'm trying to make this an arrangement, not a rescue." "What's the difference?" She thought about it carefully. "An arrangement means I chose it," she said. "A rescue means I didn't have any other choice. I do have other choices. I'm choosing this one." He was quiet for a long moment. A dog barked somewhere in the town, and then went quiet. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat together on the porch steps as the darkness settled in fully around Oregon City, the children long since asleep inside, the sounds of the town quieting one by one, different sounds than Missouri, different sounds than the trail, the sound of a place that had learned to stay. She was in no hurry. She had not been permitted to be in no hurry for 7 months, and she was not going to waste the feeling now that it had arrived. After a while, Caleb said, without preamble, "She would have liked you." Clara understood he meant his wife. "I hope so," she said. "She would have," he said. "She liked people who don't give up." Clara looked up at the Oregon sky, which was different from the trail sky. Not that vast bone-colored emptiness, but something closer and softer. The clouds low and moving gently, smelling faintly of the rain that would come by morning. She thought about Robert. She thought about the marker in the Kansas ground that had not lasted a winter. She thought about the ring and the counter and the Swede with the yellowed fingernails and the man on the barrel by the window who had, for reasons she still did not entirely understand, decided that a stranger's small piece of gold was worth doing something impulsive for. She thought, some things are not bargains. Some things are not loans, and not charity, and not arrangements. Some things are just one person deciding that another person matters. On a morning in June, in the dusty yard of a fort in Wyoming territory, with the mountains still ahead and the morning light just beginning to warm the ground, she turned the ring once, slowly, on her finger. She did not take it off. Much later, when her daughter Mary was grown and married and living in a house 10 miles east of her mother's on the Willamette Valley land, and the valley had filled in around them with neighbors and roads and the particular ordinary comfort of a life that had been built deliberately, Mary asked Clara about the ring, about Robert, and about Caleb, and about how a person holds two things that don't seem like they should fit together and makes room for both of them without breaking either one. Clara thought about it for a long time before she answered. "You don't have to stop loving what you lost," she said finally, "to make space for what arrives." Mary wrote that down in her own journal. It was still there, in the margin of a page, when her grandchildren found it 50 years later, written small and careful, the way you write something you intend to keep.